How do you dial in a green or unroasted coffee bean? This is easily the most commonly asked question that I get when it comes to my roasting stuff. Ever since we started sharing about this stuff online, it is always a question that comes up. How do you go from having a raw, unprocessed green coffee bean to delivering the final product that you put on your online store? And I get it, because it is a really paralyzing process. And to be honest, I was probably more nervous about that than anything else to do with the roastery. Now, I'll preface this by saying I am not an expert when it comes to coffee roasting. I am an avid learner. I love learning new things. And I thought, I think I could probably figure this out with enough work, but I'm still less than a year into this whole process. That being said, I feel like I have some stuff that I can share that will be helpful, but I do want to explain that this has been a little bit of a funny process for me. And some of that is to do with my wiring. We roast on this thing, the Roast L200 Ultra sample roaster. And before we got it, this is just the way I am. I got a bunch of books. I read a bunch of books. I read a bunch of blogs. I followed a bunch of people who did coffee roasting, and I tried to fully understand the process of what is happening when you roast coffee. And I feel like I did a pretty good job of wrapping my head around the fundamentals. So when we first got the roaster, I had gotten some green coffee, some of which I had roasted by other people. So I knew what it should taste like with the way that I liked it. And I put it into the roaster with very high expectations. And what came out was good, but it was not as good as I wanted it. I wanted it to be just as good as that coffee that I had had from roasters who have been doing this for years and years and years. Maybe not realistic, but where I ended up going from that process was kind of a process that I think can be very helpful to people who are starting roasting. And the first step was taking all of that carefully crafted preconceptions that I had about how to roast coffee and setting them all aside and just trying a lot of different things and seeing how it impacted the cup of coffee. So I talked to a lot of other users who were using these roasters. I roasted samples with a lot of different profiles, and I lined them all up in a row, and I cupped them, which basically means sampling them one after the next. Now, I got a whole video on cupping coffee if you're at all interested in learning what that process looks like. If you're going to start roasting, you're going to be doing a lot of it. And for a season, I really stopped trying to understand what was happening, and I actually went backwards. I just would throw random stuff at the roaster, random profiles that people said were amazing at different coffees, and I tried to find what I would like. And some profiles that people said were the best thing ever, I didn't actually like at all. They didn't work for whatever reason. My altitude, my air pressure, my roaster configuration, the green coffee I was using, could have been anything. But eventually, what started to happen is I started to pair off different profiles and kind of zone in on a few that I was actually quite happy with across a wide variety of coffees. And eventually I honed in on one specific profile that I got from somebody, Reese actually at Central Coast Coffee, who said, hey, I really like this profile on the Ultra. You should have a go and see how you make out with it. And I really did like that profile. I do like it. I find it's very flexible. If you're a roast user, I will leave it down there in the description. And I found that it was giving me a pretty good baseline. And so what I did was I used that profile as a starting point. And once I had sifted through all those different profiles and said, this is the one where I feel like I get the results that I like the most often, I felt like that was a really good place to be at, because I felt like I had a starting point where generally, no matter what kind of coffee I was working with, within the types of coffees that I like to roast, I'm going to be starting from a pretty good place. And I think you need to get to that point before you start dialing in. If you try to dial in a green coffee from absolute zero, every single time, unless you're very, very skilled, you are going to be doing a lot of trial and error because there are just so many variables. Now, I should say that you don't need to be using this specific roaster or this caliber of roaster to do this. Whatever home roaster you may have, if it has any kind of momentum at all, it's very likely that there is a community of people built around that roaster. I'm going to recommend that you find that community on the internet and you start to plug in and you start asking other users questions and you start digging for profiles. If you expect to just grab a profile and tell your roaster to do it and you think you're going to get the perfect result, it just doesn't happen that way. There is more work to do, and I think that this is the actually most helpful place where I can give my expertise at this point. So once you have a base profile, you throw coffee in, where do you go from there? Well, some of it takes a little bit of practice because you have to know roughly where you want to drop a coffee. How dark do you like it? How light do you like it? The profile may be fantastic, but if you roast it for 60% too much time, it's not going to be the way you want, no matter what you do. So the first step is doing a couple roasts and figuring out, okay, I like the roast at about this level. And if you're just starting really from scratch, you can do that with a lot of roasters have one of these. It's called a trier. And basically, as beans are roasting, you can even take them out and look at them mid-roast and just make a judgment call of when to drop it. You want to be listening for first crack. Some roasters like this one will auto-detect when that is, but that's basically when you start to hear the beans start popping in there. That generally is called the start of the development phase. And for most people, you want to try and drop your coffee at some point during the development phase. It may be at first crack, it may be shortly after first crack, it may be a measure of time following first crack. You can also measure that time by end temperature. That's actually how I do it on this machine. So at this point, for me, I've roasted enough coffees where I can kind of say, okay, this is coffee. It was grown at about this altitude. It is a washed, processed coffee. This variety, I think based on my experience with previous coffees, I'm going to start with a finish temperature of X. You could do development time also. And that will be my, let's say, first guess. Now, if you're really starting from scratch and you don't have the experience with a lot of different coffees to be able to make a first guess where you feel like, I feel like this is even like halfway informed, what I would suggest is to figure out where your first crack is and then drop the same coffee on the same curve at several points of development following first crack and just cup them. See where you like it the best. And then wherever you like it the best, use that as your starting point. Now, once I've done that, what I will usually do is I will have that coffee that I dropped at my guess temperature. From there, I'll do 2 other roasts of the same coffee on the same curve. One of them I will roast a little bit more, and one of them I will roast a little bit less. Not by a lot. In my case, it's a difference of, 1 to 1.5 degrees on the drop temperature, which is not actually a lot of time, but does have a difference in flavor. And what I'll do is I will take the 3 roasts with this kind of staggered end temperature. I call it a bracketing, and I'll cup each one of those coffees. And I'll do this with Sarah. And what we do is we put the beans in a cupping bowl. We number the bottoms of the bowl to corresponding numbers for our samples so that we know which is which, and then we mix them all up. Now, if you really want to go over the top, the best way to do this is with 3 cupping bowls per sample. Sometimes we cheat that, but if you really want to weed out any kind of defects, that's the best way to do it. And what we do from that point is we rank our samples from 1 to 3. We say, okay, this was my favorite, this was my least favorite, this one was in the middle, and why that is. And we do that independently, and then we compare notes. And surprisingly, most of the time we're aligned on that. Now, if both of our favorites was the middle coffee, we're almost good. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll do another round where I decrease the difference in drop temperature and try it again. And then we just try and narrow in and in and in on the final roast until we're sure we've got it. If our favorite is one of these, what I do from that point is I kind of set these roasts aside. Let's say our favorite is this one, the lightest roasted one. In that case, I do a new run where basically this is the center temperature. And then I have one roasted even lighter. And then I have the original middle one, which is now the darkest one, also roasted. And we will do the same process. We will number the bottoms of the cups. We will have the corresponding number in the samples. We will mix them all around so we don't know which one is which. We will cup them all individually and compare notes. And if our favorite is this one again, we repeat the process. We shift the bracket, we add a lighter development, and then we do the same thing. And we keep doing that until our favorite one is the one right in the middle of the bracket. And again, sometimes we will do an additional round where we get rid of the outside ones, and we actually go for a smaller difference between them all, and then we cup them again. It is a lot of trying to hone in on the best flavor profile for your cup of coffee. Now, for those of you out there who are experienced roasters, you're probably listening in and thinking, yeah, this is really basic, because this is really basic. Essentially, I'm talking about taking a curve that I think tends to work for me most of the time and adjusting one condition, the end condition, until we get to a result that we like. It's pretty simplistic. And I'm going to say that is simplistic. But also, I think that that is okay, because at a certain point, you actually need to transition. And this is a hard thing for anybody who is doing a craft of some kind. You need to transition from you are crafting to you're delivering. At a certain point, you need to actually deliver something to people. So I think if you can get to a point where there are several people in agreement that whatever it is that you're doing, X coffee roast or whatever, is really good, and it stands up along other coffee roasters where you are like, wow, I'm feeling like this coffee is actually standing alongside some other coffee roasters that I really respect. Could you maybe make it better? Yes, but also there's a value in knowing when to stop and when to shift. So figuring out when that point was actually a learning experience in and of itself, because early on I would just tweak and tune, and at a certain point I would just be either making the coffee worse or making way too many adjustments that weren't actually going to be noticeable in the end, and kind of going into over-analysis mode and ending up paralyzing myself when really I wasn't dealing with a huge amount of coffee. I should have just posted it and started offering it. Now, that doesn't mean you should never try and optimize further, because, if you're into this stuff, you'll know like what works for a high altitude washed coffee is not going to translate to a mid altitude coffee that is highly processed, for example. You're going to want to do some different things with how the heat is being applied to the bean in order for that roast to turn out as good as possible. So we do tweak that stuff. We look at moisture levels of the coffee. There are tools that you can use to do that. And we try and infer both on the starting point and based on how the bean is reacting when we're roasting, different things about how we may want to adjust things. And the temptation is to make a bunch of changes based on what you're seeing and see how it turns out, which I did many times, and also was the wrong approach. The best approach for this thing is much slower and much less satisfying, but more rewarding in the end. And it's actually take the same approach with the bracketing as you do with other variables. Let's say I'm looking at the curves and I'm feeling like, based on what I'm tasting, that a certain coffee could use more heat in the early stage of the roast. Maybe the temperature isn't coming up as aggressively as I want. Maybe it's just a gut thing. Maybe I just want to try it to see what happens. The best way to test that is to do 3 separate roasts, keep all the conditions the same, including the end condition, and change how the heat is applied at the beginning of the roast. One value. Change it, cup the difference, see what happens. Make your notes, and you're going to end up learning something. Don't go and change a bunch of other variables at the same time. Raise the temperature at the beginning, maybe do a little bit less aggressive at the end, and then do 3 different end temperature brackets. Even by that point, you're starting to change too much stuff to pull any kind of valuable information out of it. The best way to learn is to actually just take that really slow, really incremental approach. 3 samples, rely on your tongue first and your brain second, as tempting as it is to do the opposite for a lot of people, including myself, and make slow incremental changes. Then you may end up with, say, a profile that you like to use more for washed coffees and one that you like to use for highly processed coffees. And as you test and cup lots of different coffees over many, many months and eventually years, you have built up that experience to have a shorter path to the best end roast until you get a new roaster, and then you have to start all over again. So it's kind of simple in some ways, but it does require a lot of perseverance. It may be not the most emotionally satisfying way, but that is how we dial in a green coffee. We change one small variable at a time. We create a bracket of samples. We rank those samples blind. And if our preference is on the edge of the bracket, we redo things until our top choice is right in the center of the bracket. Once we're feeling like a coffee stands up to the level of quality that we want to deliver, sometimes we'll just ship it. Sometimes we'll experiment further actually after we ship. And even if we make it better, we won't actually deliver that for the sake of consistency, but we'll keep it in our notes for the next time. But in a nutshell, it's not really that complicated. Small changes, one change at a time, bracketing your samples, and cupping a lot of coffee. So that's how we dial in green coffee. I'm going to be bringing you some very exciting updates on our roastery shortly. But in the meantime, if you have a specific question, I'd love for you to drop it in the comments. If I can answer it, I will. I hope your next cup of coffee is fantastic, and we'll see you on the next one.